Welcome to our lesson on first species counterpoint. When we talk about counterpoint, then we talk about the independence of musical lines. That means the horizontal independence of musical lines. In this case, we have two horizontal lines that are relatively independent. That is the definition of counterpoint. When we talk about species counterpoint, we talk about Renaissance counterpoint. The Renaissance was the time period in music from about 1450 through 1600. So it's the time period before the Baroque period. What is very important is what drives the music forward. And what drives the music forward is the tension that is created by some intervals and the release of the tension. Now, in first species counterpoint, we actually only have perfect intervals. But in order to see what intervals we actually have, let's analyze it. When we analyze species counterpoint, we actually just write the generic interval in between the two voices. So we only focus on this example. So this is already a given example, and this one we will complete later. So here from A to A we have an octave, so we write an A. It's just the generic interval. That means we don't need the quality, whether it's perfect or for the major and minor intervals, whether they're major or minor. So just the generic interval. So notice please two treble clefs. So C to E is a third, B to G is the interval of a sixth, D to F a third, C to E a third. So this is our analysis. E to C a third, F to A a third, and of course I made a mistake. E to C of course is the interval of a sixth, third, E to B is a perfect fifth. Now for the fifths, it's actually quite important to know whether it's perfect or diminished, because the diminished fifth is a dissonance, the perfect fifth is a consonance. We don't have to write that it is a perfect fifth, but we need to analyze, or in our head we need to say, okay, it's a perfect fifth and that is accepted. Because in first species counterpoint, only consonances are allowed, not dissonances. D to B is the interval of a sixth, C to A a sixth, B to G sharp a sixth, and A to A is an octave. So what we can notice is that in this species counterpoint we only have perfect intervals and imperfect consonances. The thirds and the sixths are imperfect consonances. The thirds and the sixths are imperfect consonances, and the octaves and the perfect fifths are perfect consonances. Consonances means that the interval sounds relatively nice, the two notes with each other. So like an octave, third, sixth, fifth. We do not have any dissonances such as seconds or sevenths. Also, what is important to know is that in the Renaissance music, the fourth, regardless of whether it was perfect or augmented, the interval of a fourth was considered a dissonant interval. And that had to do with the tuning system at that time. It actually sounded dissonant. So we will also not find a perfect fourth in first species counterpoint, because only consonances are allowed. So among these consonances again are perfect consonances, which are the perfect intervals, and imperfect consonances, the thirds and the sixths. And so the imperfect intervals have a little bit of tension, and that tension is released when uh, when the imperfect interval is resolved into a perfect interval, or more, even more so here at the end. We also notice that the counterpoint starts on a perfect interval and it ends on a perfect interval. At the beginning, a piece can start on an octave, on a unison, or on a fifth. The piece can only end on an octave or on a unison. Now, if the original melody, the cantus firmus, CF, the cantus firmus, the original melody, is in the lower voice, then usually the melody goes up, which means the upper voice, the counterpoint, goes down. In fact, the type of motion is very important because it makes the counterpoint more independent. That means the two different voices more independent. So what are the types of motion? We have contrary motion. So when the two voices go in contrary to each other. Here we have contrary motion, contrary motion. Now we also have parallel motion, but we cannot allow perfect fifths or perfect octaves in parallel motion. We can only allow, or unison for that matter is not allowed. Only the imperfect intervals are allowed in parallel motion. We also have similar motion. Both voices go in the same direction, but at both are different intervals. This is the third, this is going to a sixth, a third going to a sixth, so similar motion. So the types of motion are contrary motion, parallel motion, similar motion, and here is one more type, and that is called an oblique motion. One voice stays the same, the other voice moves. It's called oblique motion. So now how does it sound? Let me play through this. It starts on a perfect consonance, it ends on a perfect consonance. We may have occasional perfect consonances in between, but the majority of the sonorities within the piece, after the beginning and before the end, are imperfect consonances. And there are very strict rules on how to approach the perfect consonance. The perfect consonance, like here, how it is approached, it can only be approached either in contrary motion, like here, or it may be approached in oblique motion. Oblique motion. This is a type of oblique motion, except here we are not approaching a perfect interval, we are approaching a sixth. But oblique motion is when one voice stays the same, the other one moves. So perfect intervals can only be approached by contrary motion or oblique motion, never by similar motion, and never by parallel motion. So basically those are the rules, and so if we follow the rules, then we will always we will always get a nice piece that sounds good. The rules were derived from existing music at that time, and if we duplicate the rules, that means if we apply the rules in a new piece of music, as we will do in a second here, then we will actually get a piece of music that sounds nice. So let us start. Since the cantus firmus is here in our own piece, is also in the lower voice, the lower voice will eventually go up and down, which means the majority of the intervallic motion in the upper voice will be down and up at the end. And in fact, sometimes it might be worth going backwards. I didn't draw the bar lines. I will draw them here so that's easier to see. All right. So we end on a perfect octave. And it is always important to immediately write the numbers in. That is our analysis, because we can see how we approach it, and we can also know what kinds of intervals we are using. So if we are not allowed to use any sevenths or seconds or fourths, because those are considered dissonances, or ninths for that matter. We cannot use the ninth being the compound equivalent of a second. Now, this particular piece is in Dorian. No accidental starts on D to D. If you need a review of church modes, please watch the video on modes. But this particular piece is in Dorian. Now, in Dorian, Aeolian, and in Mixolydian, we actually raise the seventh scale degree in the penultimate measure. So now we are approaching the octave in the last measure in contrary motion. So we are approaching it from the interval of a sixth to the interval of an octave. Now, I need to stay on task. This is our ending, and we can also do our beginning. We start on an octave, and we probably want to go down. Since we're coming from a perfect interval, we need an imperfect interval here. We could also go in oblique motion. That would be possible if we were to stay on D, but it is better to actually move the voice in contrary motion to make the voices more independent. The more contrary motion we have in a counterpoint, the more independent the lines will be. So we could leap down here, and then we have the interval of a third, and we could go a little bit in parallel motion, maybe leap up to a sixth, have some oblique motion to go to a third. Maybe we want to have, remember we can have an occasional perfect interval in the middle of the piece, but primarily it will be imperfect consonances. But we may have a perfect consonance, so if we are going up here to a fifth, the rule is that perfect intervals can only be approached by either contrary motion or oblique motion. In this case, the motion is in contrary motion. The upper voice goes up, the lower voice goes down. If I stay here with C in oblique motion, we get a third here. Maybe we can go in parallel motion down. And maybe one more. We surely don't want to have more than 3 times the same interval in a row, because it makes the voices too dependent upon each other if we have too much parallel motion. But now we start our counterpoint on a perfect octave, we end on a perfect octave, we have one perfect interval in the middle, and all the other intervals in between are imperfect consonances. So if we play through this, it should sound nice if we did not make a mistake. If we analyzed everything correct, it should sound nice. It does sound nice. So again, the rule is start on a perfect octave, perfect unison, or perfect fifth. We have to end on either a perfect octave or perfect unison. We may have an occasional perfect interval in the middle. All others in first species counterpoint are only imperfect consonances. That means thirds or sixths. No fourths, that was considered a dissonance. Dissonance in Renaissance music. No fourths, no seconds, no sevenths, no ninths. And we don't want to have the voices too far apart. So if we don't really want to go beyond a tenth. That means an octave and a third, although we can have it occasionally, but generally speaking, we don't want the voices too far apart. So now we analyzed the piece and we created our first species counterpoint.